me, please.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen of the press. I want to welcome you to this press conference being organized by the Barbados Labour Party to update you on the campaign thus far and to address some elements of the manifesto which was released by the Democratic Labour Party. At the outset, I want to say as campaign manager for the Barbados Labour Party that our campaign is going quite smoothly at this point in time. It's being rolled out according to plan. We kicked off on the 3rd of January with our virtual campaign, where, as you will see, it was hosted here. This was a setup for these meetings, which were then televised via the social media, various social media, and indeed we had satellite areas in various communities to address where those meetings were addressing, like, for example, the city or St. Michael West. We had appropriate satellite viewing points in those constituencies. The virtual campaign went quite well. Persons generally adhered to the wearing of masks, the social distancing, and the sanitizing. People coming in, they heard their temperatures were taken and their hands were sanitized. We released, or I should say we properly released our manifesto last Saturday, and most of you participated in that. And then we had a meeting on Monday night, again based here, where we addressed Sunday night, sorry, where we address some of those matters. We subsequently move into the mode of predominantly spot meetings, and these are what we've been focusing on over the past few days. As part of the protocols, we were mandated, and all political parties, that they could only have three large events. We had our first large event last night in six roads. Our opponents, the Democratic Labour Party, as you're aware, would have had three already. One at, and they would have had theirs at Haggett Hall, at Brereton, and I believe the first one was in Checker Hall, where they kicked off their campaign. We are certainly buoyed by the positive response of the general public in Barbados to the Barbados Labour Party, to what we've achieved in the last 3.5 years. There's been enthusiasm about our manifesto and several thousands of uploads of the BLP manifesto. Persons have been engaging us, and I believe there is a feeling in the campaign that we are doing well. Things are going relatively well for us. Of course, this will be a very busy weekend, and you will see an intensification of these spot meetings in various areas. At this point in time, we are not contemplating any massive meetings after last night's. So we're encouraging persons as we go along to continue to observe the protocols and to avoid arguments, and let us continue to have a very peaceful and incident-free campaign during the coming days. Thank you. I'm going to hand over now to the Prime Minister.
Good afternoon, everyone, and let me thank you for coming here this afternoon to this press conference. You've heard from the General Manager of the campaign that things are going according to what we anticipate, but I wanted today, as I promised last night, to address some matters related to the election manifesto of the Democratic Labour Party. And I do so conscious that we have a responsibility to be fair in what we can achieve and what we can, as a country, view as realistic going forward. It is our view that what has been put before us is not only inappropriate, but elements of it are way beyond the capacity of the government of Barbados and the people of Barbados to be able to afford. And to that extent, I had my financial team do an urgent assessment yesterday and costing of the key measures that might otherwise want to be reviewed. And those measures show that it will cost the government of Barbados just under $800 million if they were to ever have the opportunity to implement them. In addition to that, there are some inaccuracies that really relate to things that have already been done, and to that extent, it is unfortunate that it would find itself in the current state of a manifesto. I'd like to ask Ryan Strawn, who has been the Minister in the Ministry of Finance, to address the details of the fiscal measures, from the garbage and sewage charge to the excise tax to the foreign exchange fees, to all of these things that sound wonderful and lovely, but which will put this country in serious difficulty if ever they were implemented, and in my humble opinion, return us to a very precarious economic position. In addition to that, I'd like to ask him to be able to speak generally to the economic measures in their manifesto, and we will come back, because this really is more about what we can afford and what we cannot afford as a country. And that is why we've been very clear in our own statements as to what is possible at this point in the economic and fiscal affairs of Barbados. Ryan?
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen of the press, and to all Barbadians. Thank you very much, Prime Minister. The Barbadians will be aware that we have spent the last 3.5 years stabilizing the economic conditions in Barbados. And to the extent that we have been publishing to the public, both in Parliament as well as the various assessments that we have received with respect to the achievement of our targets under the Barbados Economic Recovery and Transformation Program. What we as a party put out with respect to our own manifesto was in relation to policies that we had settled internally in order to be able to help transform and drive economic growth in Barbados. And I don't have to remind the public of the state of the quality or lack thereof quality of the provision of public services that we inherited when coming to office. And therefore, we had to implement a series of reforms that would ensure that those public services, namely the collection of garbage, transport services, dealing with the sewage on the South Coast, which really was a national problem, And these are just three of the very critical things that had to be addressed, which I will make reference to in my brief remarks. And therefore, having settled, and I think Barbadians can appreciate that there's a clear difference with respect to the quality of those services being provided today than when we took office 3.5 years ago. And it is within that context that I want to discuss with Barbadians what is being proposed, because I am absolutely certain that none of my constituents in Christchurch East Central, nor any of yours, Prime Minister, in St. Mirren Northeast, would want to go back to the days where we have long, I hope, not just forgotten, but would want to ensure never ever arise in this country again. And so, having gone through what has been proposed by the Democratic Labour Party with respect to some very specific measures, and I want to say to Barbadians that whilst within households, because COVID-19 certainly has had a significant impact on all of us, the reality is that the reforms that we had introduced were intended specifically to ensure that those services can be delivered for you and your family, and that the kind of public health conditions that we saw in this country developing under the last administration would be a thing of the past. And therefore, the idea of the reduction of the garbage and sewage charge, given that whilst we have been able to take the garbage off the street, the sewage, off the streets of Barbados, there still remains a long-term solution to be financed, which affects all Barbadians. With respect to the collection of garbage, we have all determined that we must share in this burden, and the extent to which the operations of the Sanitation Service Authority, the actual maintenance of the trucks and the servicing, we have determined that within the context of the budget, that the garbage and sewage contribution will be dedicated specifically to ensuring that we can maintain those services for all Barbadians, such that persons no longer have to feel any measure of distress with respect to those matters. And what is being proposed effectively would mean that there's $41 million less to provide those services on an annual basis. So the question to the Democratic Labour Party is, where will this $41 million come from in order to provide these critical services to Barbadians? With respect to the reduction in the excise tax in terms of fuel at the pump, this is anticipated to cost $31 million. And therefore, given where the economy is at the moment, again, the question is, where will this money come to help provide the range of services that government continues to provide, even in the middle of a pandemic, to ordinary Barbadians? And therefore, these are not just glib questions to be glossed over. These are absolutely critical for Barbadians to appreciate, that when they go to the polls next Wednesday, that they have to understand how these things are being financed. Barbadians know today that they can almost set their watch and know that the garbage truck will turn up at a specific time on a specific day. And I can say to Barbadians that whilst we have had to take these critical reforms, it is really in your interest, for the short, medium, and long term, that we can maintain these services, and that we cannot be trifled with as a political tool in order to try to gain favor for votes. And therefore, we must be responsible with respect to where the state of the economy is, the capacity of the government to deliver these things, because at the end of the day, the numbers have to add up. And we all know what happened under the last administration, where a range of things were not paid for, and we are still, and let me just make it abundantly clear this afternoon, the government of Barbados today is still paying for the fuel that was used by both the Sanitation Service Authority as well as the Transport Board. There were just about $60 million in arrears that the government is still paying today that was left unpaid for these services. And therefore, I want Barbadians to appreciate that we have structured a series of reforms that, one, caters to their needs, but also is fiscally responsible, so that you and your families can live comfortably, as comfortably as possible, given the circumstances in the country. With respect to the abolition of the foreign exchange fee, clearly we have been in a program in order to get ourselves out of what we inherited. And as an economist, when it was introduced, I was against it. But the reality of our condition is that the foreign exchange fee brings in $79 million a year. Until such time as we can get out, and it was always our intention at the end of this program to be able to remove it. But we've had COVID, and therefore, until such time as we can get through this, I'm not saying here that anything is definitive, but the point is, removing it at this time when the tourism sector has not come back fully, I think is irresponsible. And once I say to Barbadians that as an economist, I abhor the fact that the last government had to introduce the foreign exchange fee. It is delivering for us at the moment a level of revenue that, having lost $600 million in the previous fiscal year, that we must ask ourselves, where will these monies come from? But it can give the country the assurance that as soon as we're able to do that, we will be able to remove this particular tax in order to be able to alleviate that. So again, $79 million would have to be found to help make up for the gap that we already have. With respect to the asset tax, it's the same thing, $48 million. All of these are things introduced by the last government. And therefore, let us appreciate that you cannot simply say you're going to remove something unless you have the capacity to replace it. We have been focused on trying to get growth. COVID has been a disruptor, and we are absolutely confident that once we can do so, then these things can be phased out in a responsible way that allows the quality of services to continue. We all know that we had to execute the public debt restructuring at the beginning, in 2018. And the promise to make whole pensioners will cost the government of Barbados $350 million approximately. And therefore, again, we ask, to put it very clear, you're suggesting that we must now find $350 million from somewhere, having already said you're going to reduce by $41 million the garbage and sewage contribution, $31 by the excise, $79 by the foreign exchange fee, $48 by the asset tax, approximately, that you're now going to try to make whole the pensioners under the debt restructuring. And it is quite emotive. It is quite emotive. I understand that the attempt is to pull or tug at the heartstrings of Barbadians. But I say to Barbadians that when we look at these numbers, it is simply not feasible. And therefore, I say to all Barbadians, let us remain focused on what is achievable, and this government is intending to deliver for Barbadians what we know can be delivered. And let me just say, lastly, that we have determined that strategically we must mobilize all of the domestic resources in the country. And therefore, it is our commitment and intention to work strategically with the credit union movement specifically because of the ownership structure in order to be able to deliver for Barbadians the renewable energy revolution. And therefore, to suggest that you are going to distribute panels to persons from government would cost $219 million to do. And therefore, again, I know that the Democratic Party is seeking to put a face to the public in order to get votes to win an election. But having spent, Prime Minister, the last 3.5 years working to bring a measure of not just respectability, but fiscal prudence to the government of Barbados, I say this afternoon to Barbadians that what you see in this Democratic Party manifesto is not feasible. And I say so knowing that, one, and I know the Prime Minister will speak to it, we published a pre-election report as part of the Public Finance Management Act. We have done 3 mid-year reviews to update Barbadians in Parliament about the fiscal condition all the way through this program. And therefore, whilst I appreciate that governments will always have to determine the policy, these numbers simply do not add up. And therefore, I say to Barbadians, read the manifesto of the Barbados Labour Party. You know our track record, certainly over the last 3.5 years. you have seen and experienced a marked increase in the quality of the delivery of public services. And I think you can trust that the Barbados Party will be responsible, and that going forward, that in transforming this country, that as we have given the firm commitment, we have shared in the burden thus far, and therefore going forward, our mission is to ensure that whatever bounty there is, that ordinary Barbadians can share in that. And that is why we have determined that mobilizing our domestic financial resources strategically within the context of the credit union movement is one of those avenues in order to ensure that ordinary Barbadians can benefit from the renewable energy revolution. Thanks very much, Prime Minister.
Thank you very much, Ryan. As Ryan indicated, there are some measures as well which are not simply available for us to cost out. The universal basic income, which is here. The question of also the gift of solar panels on every rooftop. We believe on the basis of an assumption of 3 kilowatt panels, what they're promising will cost over $220 million, so that there has to be some level of realism to what we can do. On the issue of pensions, let me make it clear that with respect to the pensions, all pensioners got back their investment and some interest when we restructured our debt. Those under $250,000 got cash, while those over $250,000 got bonds. And therefore, the promises don't meet the reality. And at the appropriate time, if you want, I can send you back to the press releases of 2018 so that you can see for yourself what was done then by the government with respect to the pensioners. So all in all, we ask Barbadians to consider where we have come from and where we have gotten, and to make decisions on Wednesday that are based on the interests of not just this country, but yourselves, because we have little room for error. I am happy to lead a government that passed legislation that allows us, for example, to be able to lay, not just signed by me as Minister of Finance, but signed by the Director of Finance and Economic Affairs, who has a statutory obligation as well to deal with what is known as the pre-election update. And the Director of Finance is required by law to sign separate from the Minister of Finance to guarantee the integrity of the pre-election update. I also want to give this country the assurance that unlike the last government, and in spite of the absence of a legislative framework prohibiting it, which we may well discuss in our constitutional reform once the country undertakes it, this government has refused to issue any major contracts during the election period, as was done by the last government with Global Ports and other contracts just days before the election. It is wrong, and therefore we are holding ourselves to a higher standard, both with respect to the issuance of those contracts, but also with respect to the statement of our financial and economic performance and the outlook that is expected, so that Barbadians may make a sensible, independent judgment as to what is the condition of our fiscal affairs and what we have done and what we intend to do from our manifestos to see what the country can bear. At this point, I'll pause and ask if there's any immediate questions. Thank you. I apologize for the state of my voice, obviously, and the breeze is not making it much easier. Excuse me.
Shane Jones, CBC News. Minister Strawn, you described the manifesto, the DLP's manifesto, and I have to admit, I got to take a lot of what you guys are saying because I haven't seen it myself yet. But you described it as an emotive one. I think the Prime Minister said it's one that would cost about $800 million, that's what you said. And Minister Strong,
No,
you point
a minimum of.
a minimum of $800
Because
million.
there's some things we don't have costings on.
Okay.
Thank you.
And Minister Strong, you were saying that when you remove taxes on all these things, you have to replace taxes in some way. Is there anything that you have seen in the Democratic Labour Party's manifesto, any initiatives that point to initiatives that can make up the shortfall? And if so, could you analyze them so we can bring your full picture into focus? Because you're saying it's going to cost all this money, it's an emotive one, but the money must be made from somewhere. So is there anything that says how this shortfall can be made?
Thanks very much for the question. There is nothing here that inspires any confidence in me that what is being proposed, one, is either feasible or that there's any specific strategy for an alternative revenue-raising measure. And that is what is missing from the whole exercise because, as I said, we have been very clear and transparent with respect to the state of the economy, and certainly because of COVID, you have to be very careful with respect to what measures are undertaken and over what specific period of time that you do so. And therefore, I don't know what is in the mind of the Democratic Labour Party. I can just go on what I see here, but I don't see anything here that tells me that if you remove these things, or if you want to introduce making things whole for the pensioners, that there's any possible way that any of these things could be achieved. And that is without prejudice to any of the other measures which we don't even know how to begin to be able to cost out, based on the assumptions. Sorry, go ahead.
Yes, hi, good afternoon. Colville Manzi, Nation News. Looking at the manifesto of the Democratic Labour Party through a layman's perspective, I'm no economist by any stretch of the imagination, it seems to suggest, however, that with the IMF Extended Fund Facility coming to an end in October 2022, that given the fact that they are no longer aiming that a Democratic Labour Party government would be no longer aiming at a 6% surplus, that this would free up quite a bit of fiscal room to achieve some of the things that they're putting in place. And mind you, I'm just devil's advocate. I'm just asking your thoughts as the experts.
Let us be clear. The government of Barbados has not done a 6% surplus for any of the last 2 financial years. The COVID pandemic made that an impossibility. And what we have done is literally to work towards goals that have been modest. We did not want to see a monumental increase in debt, and this is where we really have to require people, especially persons who speak and publish, to be able to speak to the facts. When we inherited the government's debt in 2018 May, the debt stood at $16.1 billion, or $16.6 billion, sorry. We brought it down to 12.7 billion. During the course of the pandemic, we lost virtually $600 million in taxes, and we spent just over $300 million more, showing a $900 million adjustment. We only chose to raise $500 million in debt. That $500 million brings our debt, as you can see from the document I signed earlier this week, that as of the 30th of September 2021, our debt stood at $13 billion and 86. As of the end of December, it was just on or about $13.1 billion. We are $3.5 billion less in debt than we were when we took over the government. $3.5 billion less. Against that backdrop, we have seen a steady reduction in our debt. Our problem with the debt to GDP anchor is that our GDP contracted in 2020. And we expect that this year and next year, we can achieve double-digit growth to begin to bring our GDP back to where it was. But our absolute debt is $3.5 billion less. against that backdrop, we believe that we have an argument to make with the fund that a 6% surplus was relevant before COVID, but not after COVID. And what does this really mean in layman's terms? Am I going to lose weight at £6 per year, £6 per month? Or will I lose weight at £4 per month? Or will I lose weight at £2 per month? Or will I lose weight at £1 per month? Or will I put on weight? Bottom line is, we need to lose the weight. But we have to get back growth first. And once we do that, we can go on a steady path between now and 2035, and if necessary, longer, in order to be able to bring back down the debt, because what this government will not do is to sacrifice people in aid of arbitrary numbers.
And just to further support the Prime Minister, the fact that we have been steadily not just paying the debt, but just bear in mind that the unpaid bills that I mentioned before is part of that. And therefore, we must recognize that if we are going to deviate from that, it means then that potentially ordinary Barbadians as individuals or companies, and just, again, we have settled the debt, we have settled in the tax returns that were left outstanding. All of this is part of what we have determined is critical to ensuring confidence in the economy. And therefore, if the Democratic Labour Party intends to deviate from that, then let's recognize that it has consequences for the business climate, the investment climate, for which is critically important to drive growth going forward. And therefore, we've spent the last 3.5 years trying to build back and retain the trust and credibility as the government of Barbados, which I believe we have, even in the context of COVID. And therefore, with respect to the 6% primary surplus, it doesn't exist out there in a vacuum as if there's money lying around in order to be able to just spend. You have to earn that money first, determine your priorities, and then after you determine your priorities, then you know what space you have to be able to do transformation. And I think it is, for Barbadians, you have lived and felt the response to COVID, and the response to COVID has been because we set about very early to be very disciplined, to make sure that we can address those critical issues that were confronting Barbadians prior to us taking office. And our performance as government really and truly has given us, I think, as the Prime Minister referred to, the benefit of the doubt, so that when we tell people that we will do something, that it will be done. And that is why when the IMF publishes its report every 6 months, and S&P and Moody's and Carrie Chris and all of these people, when they look at our performance of government, they're not just looking at the numbers, but they're also looking at some of those very critical social metrics which we have been able to repair. And I say to Barbadians, yes, they're trying to tug at your heartstrings by saying we can do this and we're going to do that, but just understand that we have been trying to keep this economy stable in order to ensure that ordinary Barbadians can continue to live, and as we seek to transform, that they can benefit from that transformation. Thank you.
Just one final follow-up question from me. As I would have mentioned, the Democratic Labour Party's plan appears to hinge on discontinuation, sorry, not a discontinuation, a non-renewal of the extended fund facility post-October 2022. Is this a sentiment that the Barbados Labour Party can co-sign at this point? I mean, in other words, I'm asking directly, does the Barbados Labour Party intend, you're not hearing me properly?
I missed the first part, but go ahead.
Okay, to continue with the IMF arrangement post-October 2022.
Thank you, Caldwell. I think you missed my response night before last. I said very clearly in a meeting in Britain's Hill that when the time comes, we'll make those decisions. The international economy is very fluid now. Interest rates are going back up. We have to determine whether we go into the private markets or whether we stick with the IMF, where we've already implemented most of the structural reforms and continue to benefit from the cheapest money in town. But we have months before which we can make that decision, and that decision is going to be based both on the state of the international capital markets, as well as where we are with the completion of our structural reforms and what we need in terms of our financing. Excuse me. That's it?
Hello, yes, Emmanuel Joseph, Barbados today. Mr. Prime Minister, switching gears but still in relation to the election, is there any consideration being given by your government to make any special arrangements so that those COVID positive patients can vote in the coming election?
I think, Emmanuel, you know, you've been too senior journalists to ask that question, because you know that a Prime Minister of Barbados has no locus standi in the conduct of general elections. That is a matter solely for the Electoral and Boundaries Commission. Thank you.
Okay. And then there been some talk about challenging the election in court. Is there any concern you have about that? You know, any ground you think that they have to succeed in this effort?
When I became an attorney at law at 21, my father taught me one thing. You argue a case once in court. If they bring it to court, we'll argue it. Thank you.
Thank you.
Are there any other questions? If not, I want to thank all of you for coming here this afternoon, and do have safe travels and continue observing the protocols. Thank you.